Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. As some of you know, this is the first of three series, first part of a three-part series. So on our topic of what's happening. So welcome. Thank you for giving up your lunchtime to be with us today. Just to point out a couple of things. This event is being recorded, and there are also subtitles at the bottom of your screen as well, just to enable greater viewing for everybody. This event is brought to you by Mills Reeve and ORCHA, working in collaboration. And just to say, ORCHA is the world's leading independent digital health evaluation and distribution organisation, enabling safe digital adoption. And Mills Reeve are a law firm who provide legal and regulatory support and advice to a range of sectors, but in particular, focusing here today, the health, life sciences and technology sectors. And we have a particular interest in digital health within those sectors. So as I mentioned, this webinar is looking at the first of three. Today we're focusing on starting out on our digital health landscape, just to flag for the future events coming up. The next session is on the way, thinking about where you are heading. That's on the 26th of May, same time. And that's looking at really development part of the process. And the final session is ready to launch, ensuring everyone's happy. And that's on the 16th of June, again at 1 p.m. You'll need to register separately for each event, so you can do that by clicking on the link in the slides that will be circulated after this session. I'd like to introduce our speakers today and give a very warm welcome to both Steph and Liz. Steph's a Principal Associate at Mills Reeve, and she specialises in a number of things, but in particular digital health. Liz is the Chief Executive of ORCHA. I'll be chairing the session and helping with the Q&A a little bit later. The format is that Liz is going to present in just a moment, and then Steph will do a short presentation afterwards, and then we'll follow with a Q&A session. So please do pop any questions you have in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try and answer as many as possible. Any that we aren't able to answer, we'll cover off afterwards or at further sessions. And finally, and I will say a reminder at the end, there will be a feedback form, and we'd really would invite you to complete that. It only takes a couple of moments, but it will help us to feed into the second and third sessions in this series, to make sure that you get out of it everything that you would like, and also any further sessions that we run, particularly on health tech and digital health. So we'd be really grateful for any feedback that you do have. And if you'd like to get in contact with any of the three of us, then you can, if you scan the QR code, that'll take you to our LinkedIn pages, and further contact details will be provided in later slides. So without further ado from me rumbling on about admin, I'll introduce Liz, and Liz is going to share her screen in a second. So I will cease to share mine, and if you could kick off, Liz, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte. And thank you for inviting me to join today. I'm absolutely delighted. As Charlotte said, my name's Liz Ashall-Payne, and I'm the founding Chief Exec at ORCHA. Just a tiny little bit of information about what I'm going to talk to you about today. So I'm going to be sharing with you some high-level stats about the world of digital health. We're obviously talking about apps, and when I talk about apps, I'm not just talking about apps on the App Store, also talking about digital health websites and web-based solutions. My background is an NHS clinician, and I've spent most of my career either working in or with the NHS. ORCHA stands for the Organisation for the Review of Care and Health Apps. However, our mission isn't to review, our mission is to get high quality digital health solutions to people who need it. And we do that by working with different parts of the healthcare system and promoting the best to different communities. But that's obviously founded in the review, and that's why our name has got the word reviewing in the title. So what I wanted to start with was just really to share some information about what the world of digital health has looked like, particularly since COVID. So we all know that COVID has been a massive accelerant for digital health. And what we're now seeing is every day 5 million people will download a health app. And that's seen an increase of 25% since the start of COVID, around about this time last year. What we've seen is a significant increase in certain areas of downloads. So mental wellness apps saw 10 million downloads in April 2020 alone. And if you looked at the end of last year, we saw a 92% increase from 2019 to 2020 in Couch to 5K. So we're seeing a significant increase in people looking to digital health to either support themselves with their physical health or mental health. We've also seen a real shift, and this is breaking down some of the myths around the age of people who use digital health. So 45% of over 75-year-olds are now keen to engage with digital health. And that's seen a massive shift, particularly just over the last couple of years. And obviously the business opportunity in the world of digital health is huge now. So Calm, which is a meditation app, is now valued at 2 billion. And we're seeing around about 30 new health apps or digital health solutions enter the marketplace every day at the moment. So we're seeing people using digital health. Age isn't a barrier, and we're seeing a huge increase in the number of products coming to market. What we're also seeing is that healthcare providers and healthcare professionals are also seeing the opportunity with the world of digital health. So over 90% of healthcare professionals in this country believe that health apps could improve their patients' health. Over 40% believe that healthcare technologies could reduce the number of visits to the doctor's office. And over 80% of healthcare professionals are already using smartphones and medical apps. And we've seen some real shift in focus towards digital health from bodies such as the World Health Organization, and more locally in this country with the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, NICE, who are now recommending that we use digital health as healthcare professionals with our patients. So we've got this huge influx of interest and drive towards digital health. But what we also know is that these solutions are not necessarily being adopted as readily as we've just seen in through those other lenses. And that's because of these 4 big barriers. There is a 5th one which I'll touch on too. But there are some key barriers to adoption of digital health solutions. And these barriers are very relevant in the NHS, but they're also relevant on a global scale. So the first barrier is awareness. And that sounds really simple, but most people don't know how many digital health solutions there are available. In fact, I'm going to ask you just to have a think about how many digital health apps you think there are currently, let alone what those solutions can help to support. And as healthcare professionals, we're not trained in this. And so that is a real barrier. Our awareness is low. Now, once you do become aware of these solutions, the next barrier for adoption is access. Where do you go to find these solutions? And you might say, well, I might go to Google Play or the Apple App Store and give it a go. Type in a word like dementia, and you might get 2 or 3 digital health solutions. You certainly won't get the full 6,000 list. So access at the most fundamental level, just finding a long list is a real challenge. The next barrier is the ultimate challenge, and it's one that I'm going to focus on actually, and that's around trust. So once you've found a product, how can you trust that these solutions will do what they say they're going to do will hold your data securely, will be compliant with GDPR, etc. And we're all a little bit nervous about what's happening in the world of digital when we use it. And unfortunately, that trust barrier is not unfounded. So our research has found that only 20% on an aggregated level of digital health solutions are meeting quality criteria. And what that means for the 5 million people who download a solution every day, that the number of people who are downloading unsafe and unregulated products is very high. The fourth barrier to adoption is ongoing governance, and this is really important if you work in an NHS organisation or in any healthcare system across the world. And what I really mean by governance is ongoing risk management. So one of the exciting things about digital health is that it will adapt and change in response to user feedback, and that's great, but with that change comes a new risk. So if I recommended a digital health app to a patient and I could assure myself that it was quality today, what happens if it introduces a new feature tomorrow which introduces a new risk or a new standard which that product's then not compliant with? How would I know? How would I do a recall? And then the fifth barrier, which isn't listed here but is worth noting, is the barrier around who pays for these solutions. And that's a real challenge because we don't want to drive further digital divide. We already know that there's a digital divide, and obviously if we're introducing a cost to the end user, that becomes a bit of a problem. I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive into the trust area. And this is just an example looking at mental health apps. So ORCHA have reviewed thousands of health apps and thousands of mental health apps. And 68% of the mental health solutions that we've reviewed have not met quality standards and regulatory compliance. And when you break that down into specific areas, you can see that only 38% of stress and anxiety apps meet the quality criteria, 52% of addiction apps meet the quality criteria, etc., etc. And obviously, if you're vulnerable and experiencing a mental health condition, finding an unsafe product is pretty dangerous. So that's just to highlight a little bit of a deep dive into one of the areas. So if we're really going to support the adoption of digital health across the NHS and across healthcare systems across the world, we have to first of all start with building trust. So I asked you to have a think about this question: how many digital health solutions are available? So there's currently over 365,000 digital health products that you can choose from. And the question is, well, which ones are safe and effective? And I've given you some stats around the unsafe products. So if we know that 20% of digital health solutions are safe and compliant with regulations and standards, the first question is, well, how do we know which ones we should be trusting? And just a little note there, just imagine if the same was true for medication. So in the world of medication and pharmaceuticals, we have a very clear process, clinical trials, which builds trust, because we've then got evidence to say that those products and those medications will have the desired impact on a patient's health outcomes. And then we have a clear place to go to find these solutions, to find these drugs, and then we have a clear prescription process. So if you think about a world that we currently have within digital health in the world of drugs, it would just seem a little bit scary, and that is where we quite often find ourselves. So we've got to build trust. And the way in which we do that is by looking at compliance with standards and regulations. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of a whistle-stop tour on this, because the next session will do a deep dive into some of these areas with a specific lens on the NHS. But there really is a regulatory puzzle, and it is quite confusing. So there are lots and lots of standards and regulations and best practice guides out there, and they're mostly fall into these 4 different domain areas: data privacy, data security, clinical assurance, and user experience. Now, the first thing to note is new regulations are emerging all the time. So this is not a static picture. So that's the first thing to note, and this is why this is a puzzle. The second thing to note is not all of these regulations and standards and best practice guides need to be applied to every single product. So, for example, I know that there's going to be some more explanation of, say, for example, the medical device regulations. Not every single product will fall into medical device regulations, and then there are different classes. So not everything is applied to every single product. And then the third thing that's really challenging about this product, this profile, is that the product keeps changing. So this regulatory puzzle is quite a challenging one. Just to go deep dive into a few of these areas, what we see, however, is that there are some universal regulations across the world in these areas. So in data privacy, data security, clinical assurance, and user experience. And what's happened over recent times, over the last couple of years, is there's been a growth in digital health assessment frameworks on a worldwide level. And most recently, you may have heard of the NHSX DTAC standard, which was announced probably about 3 or 4 weeks ago now. And what these assessment frameworks are trying to do is make sense of that regulatory landscape and create an assessment framework whereby products can be assessed to see if they meet the criteria of that assessment framework. And then if they do, then we can build trust. Now, what we've been doing at ORCHA is working with lots of these different assessment frameworks across the world, and we've pulled together the duplicated effort, if you will, across these frameworks. So there's lots and lots of, everybody's asking questions around data security, data privacy, clinical validity, user experience, and then there are some jurisdictional differences. But what we've done is we've pulled together the baseline review process. So this is the duplicated question sets on a global scale, the answers to which everybody wants to know. And what we do is we then layer on top additional criteria. So you can see here that the ORCHA baseline assessment is what is the foundation for these other verticals, which are different countries. So this first one, for example, is the GGZ, the Netherlands Digital Health Assessment Framework. You can see that the fourth one is the NHS DTAC. Just very, very briefly, and we will be going into this into more detail on the next webinar, but the NHS DTAC predominantly asks additional questions on top of some of the baseline assessment questions, predominantly in clinical safety, which is a standard called DCB 0129, and then some additional questions in technical stability and security. There is another layer on top of that, which then incorporates the evidence standard framework, which is the framework which was created by NICE. Now, we've incorporated that evidence standard into our ORCHA baseline assessment because that's been picked up globally. So that's the only framework of its kind. So we brought that into the foundation layer. And that's also because as a clinician wanting to recommend these tools, that's the key piece of information that I want to know before I want to recommend that solution to my patient. So, so that just gives you a bit of a whistle-stop tour as to some of the standards and areas of compliance that you need to think about if you're developing products. But getting these badges, so in the NHS, getting an NHS DTAC badge of approval is very powerful because NHSX are suggesting that that is pre-procurement and this is a badge of trust. Now, once you have that badge of trust and as a healthcare system, you now know which products you should now start recommending to your patients. How do we deal with those other barriers? So awareness, access and governance. So what we've been doing is we work with about 70% of the NHS at a regional or local level to create digital health libraries, which are filled with all those high quality compliant digital health solutions that these libraries can then aggregate that information, and that information can then be promoted to people, patients and healthcare professionals. And patients use it as a search engine to search and find the best solutions for their personal needs and preferences. There are filter options, so you can filter to find the best one for you specifically. And healthcare professionals use these libraries now as a formulary. So that formulary enables a healthcare professional to not only find, but now recommend via text message the best product to their patient. And it's also wrapped up in that professional formulary a whole training and workforce development offering, which is modularised according to your clinical needs and interests. Now, because we cover about 70% of the NHS, I wanted to share with you some data from these digital health libraries from across the NHS. And again, going back to it's been fascinating actually to watch what people and healthcare professionals are searching for since the start of COVID. And we're able to track this across our digital health libraries, and then we're able to share this data with colleagues in places such as Public Health England. So right at the beginning, now this won't be a surprise, but it's great to have the data to back it up. Right at the beginning of COVID, we saw a huge increase in patients, people and healthcare professionals searching for products around respiratory conditions, so asthma and COPD. And we saw a lot of recommendations of those products being recommended to patients experiencing those conditions, because obviously they were going to move into a shielding and definitely into a quarantine situation. So helping them to stay healthy and well was really important. As we moved through lockdown, mental health saw a significant increase. Mental health has always been a big area of interest for people downloading and searching and recommending products, but it's massively increased and it continues to increase. Diet and fitness towards the end of last year, and this obviously correlates with the research that was shared with us as the public around the fact that if you were overweight, you contract COVID, you're more likely to experience a more challenging time. So we saw an increase in people wanting to lose weight and get fit and healthy. What's also been interesting as we've been tracking this data, particularly this year, we've seen a lot more interest in how do we support long COVID symptoms, and we've seen significant increase in products that can help with the symptoms of long COVID. And you can see there for yourself that as time's gone on, these products have, the darker the colour, the more usage and more searching that's happened. Now, what's been really interesting is also then looking into the marketplace. So although we've seen a huge growth of digital health solutions around long COVID symptom groups, actually the growth of long COVID apps specifically has been very slow. Now, what we're starting to see in the innovator community is a real thought about, right, what can we do from an innovation perspective to help people specifically with long COVID symptoms? And so I think what we're going to see moving forward is a new range of innovations to help with this new long-term condition. And basically, my final thing to say really is that now is the time for digital health. You know, digital health apps are being used by more people, being recommended more frequently, and there's more opportunity in this space. And we've seen significant increase in the use and deployment of digital health solutions. There's still more to do, of course, but just really that third stat down there, we've seen in the NHS an increase of 6,500% in recommendations of digital health solutions from healthcare professionals to patients using our solutions, which has been fantastic. And that final piece, that final jigsaw puzzle piece that I mentioned on the barriers to adoption, is that governance. By using a system to recommend or prescribe a digital health solution, and by continuously re-reviewing and quality assuring products, which is exactly what we do with the reviews. If we find a future fault, we can do a recall, and the product could be recalled. Now, thankfully, we don't have to do that very often, but it's there should it be needed, and that just breaks down that final barrier. So happy to take questions. I know that we're going to have another presentation, but very happy to take any questions. And just to mention that there will be deep dives into the specific requirements for the NHS in the next session and the one after.
Thanks very much, Liz. That's brilliant. I'm just going to get the other presentation back up. And hopefully that's working. Is that working for you, Steph? Can you see it?
Yeah, it is. Thank you. Everyone, just to let you know, I'm having a bit of an unstable internet day, so Charlotte's very kindly going to be running the slides for me. So just very briefly, I'm a commercial lawyer in the Mills and Reeve Life Sciences team, so I focus on life sciences and health work, and one of the areas that I specialise in is medical devices and data privacy in this context. So I'm going to be talking to you a bit about some of the key issues when you're starting out that we as lawyers would like you to think about. It's obviously going to be very short because we've got other sessions where we can go into a bit more depth on how to deal with some of the issues. But if we go onto the next slide, it's just in summary what we would like you to think about as lawyers. And often what we see is that people come to us as a bit of an afterthought. So you're ready to launch your product, you want some terms and conditions ready for launch. Maybe the app store that you want to use requires you to have certain terms and conditions. And then there's also the question around privacy notices and consents. So we quite often don't see products until the end of the pipeline. And obviously, I can understand that not everyone wants to talk to lawyers straight away, particularly if you're a startup. You might be concerned about cost, but it can make things a bit more tricky if you've got to the end of your development process and you haven't thought about certain things at the beginning and while you're developing your product. So that could then delay your launch, which is obviously going to have an impact then on you being able to make revenue. So we thought it might be helpful to give you a bit of a general view of the types of questions that we as lawyers would like you to be thinking about right from the beginning, to avoid the potential hidden regulatory and compliance requirements that you might miss if you don't think about these points in advance, and the different regulatory regimes that Liz already mentioned, for example, GDPR or the medical device regulations or CQC regulations, are all things that could impact on an app or software that is being developed in the health space. So think about what data you're using, what your functionality is going to be, and what the services are that are going to be provided. And so the areas where we quite often see that complexities arise, and Liz did touch on this briefly in her slide deck, are processing of special category data. So many of you are probably aware that special category data, like health data, will attract higher levels of regulatory compliance requirements from the Information Commissioner's Office in order for you to comply with GDPR. We obviously currently have GDPR for Europe and a UK version of the GDPR, so we still have that high level of compliance requirements for special category data, and you might need consent in order to process it. That can throw up complexities if you can only give the functionality if you get the data, and can the consent then be freely given, which is a requirement under the GDPR. So those are all questions that are a bit nitty-gritty, but it's quite helpful to know from the outset what health data you're using, and why. And I'll come to the questions on the next slide. But the other area of complexity is obviously your scale of the technology that you're using, how much data you're going to be using. Are you going to be working internationally? The GDPR doesn't just apply in Europe and the UK. It can also apply if you're based outside of Europe and the UK, but you're targeting individual users within those jurisdictions. There are also complexities around what the functionality of your app is or software is offering, depending on what you're exactly doing. It could be classified as a medical device, which means you then have an additional layer of regulation around medical devices. And if you're using your app to provide a service, for example, through interacting with professionals, so in the mental health space, we've seen quite a lot of apps that will allow a user to either directly or indirectly interact with clinical psychologists or psychiatrists, which could then lead to you providing a regulated service, which attracts a greater level of scrutiny from the regulators. So in terms of your data flows, on this slide, we've got a number of questions that I've always found helpful to go through with my clients when they're thinking about their product. So in order for you to deliver what you want to deliver, what data do you need from the users, and why do you need it? Is it going to be used for treating them, or is it going to be used to make recommendations to them? Are you using the data for your own purposes, for a clinical investigation, for example? How are you collecting it? So the most common one is obviously user input into the software or app, but sometimes you might have location tracking, for example, if it's on a mobile phone. You can use GPS tracking to help with the functionality of your app. Sometimes you might have a product that you're developing that will interact with a sensor or monitor that the user is hooked up to. And those are useful things to know about, because you probably need to talk about it in your privacy policy regarding where you're getting the data from, but also it can help you identify whether you're dealing with a standalone medical device or an accessory to a medical device, if you're falling into that category. The other question that I always ask is, how much data are you collecting? The reason that we ask that is because under the GDPR, there are requirements to undertake data privacy impact assessments, particularly if you're processing large scale sensitive personal data, or if you have a new technology where sensitive personal data is being processed and there could be quite a significant impact to the user if there were a data breach, for example. And therefore having an idea of the scale of what you're dealing with can be really helpful for you to determine whether you need to do this data privacy impact assessment, which is an additional assessment rather than just having a record of what your data map is. The other question is, where's your data going? There are certain requirements for international transfers of data that you need to comply with. A lot of cases we see is where you use, for example, a cloud-based provider to store your data, and the servers for the cloud-based provider are not in the European Union. you would then need to make sure that you have the appropriate contracts in place with them, and again also inform your users about those transfers. And another question that people quite often don't think about until they get to it is, might you need the data for something else? So obviously you have the primary purpose of your data use, which is to provide something to your users and interact with your users. But if they decided to stop using your software or your app, would you want to use the data that they had inputted up until that point for developing your product further, or creating aggregate data sets that you use for research, or generally use the data for research purposes? Because if you know in advance that that is something that you're going to do with personal data, you can tell people from the outset, and that can then make your life a lot easier further down the line, because you don't have to go back and contact people for appropriate consent if you needed it. And it does help build trust with users if you can be as transparent as possible from the beginning what is going to be happening. Moving on to functionality, it's a high area of regulation. I've just spotted the typo there. Depending on the functionality of the software or app that you're providing. So software and apps in themselves can be medical devices. They don't have to be just an accessory to a large machine, for example. If you are using an app to provide diagnostics, for example, that would then be a medical device. They can also be used to provide regulated services. So I mentioned in the mental health space, if you're using it to provide a psychiatry or psychological support system with registered practitioners, you might be providing a regulated service. So think about what your app is going to be doing. If you've got a long-term pipeline, think about not just now what you're going to be doing in the first launch, but think about where you might be traveling to. And that plays nicely into Liz's comment about apps aren't static. There'll be iterations of it. So if you're thinking about it now, where you want to end up, then you can already start building in your compliance requirements at the outset, and you don't have to then every time you want to do a new iteration think about, oh, is this compliant? Have we thought about X, Y, and Z? Because you've thought about it in your life cycle for your product. And then, as I mentioned again, who is involved in providing the service if it's a service-based app, because the definition of a healthcare professional could potentially be wider than you think. So obviously we'd all think of a doctor as being a healthcare practitioner, but in some cases social workers in specific fields like mental health could be classified as a healthcare professional, and then you might quickly stray into CQC regulatory territory, which is another whole kettle of fish that you'd then have to be dealing with in order to make sure that your product is up to scratch and that you're not falling foul of any regulations. And what's worth noting is, before I come on to the examples, is that in some cases, if you're not compliant with the regulations, you might be committing a criminal offence, and subject to fines, in some cases imprisonment. I know in medical device regs there is an offence if you don't follow certain requirements around clinical investigations, so it's always worth bearing that in mind as the kind of worst case scenario. I just thought this might be helpful examples of medical device software, because it's not necessarily always clear. So most people now have smart watches. You have an app on your smartwatch, it sends a notification to the user, when it recognises an irregular heartbeat, and the whole purpose of the app is to help detect cardiac arrhythmia, so that's helping diagnosis. Software that is intended to operate as a point of care test from a remote location, so that can play into your providing service, or software that makes recommendations on dosing of particular medicines. The one we see commonly is insulin dosing, and it doesn't matter what the method of delivery of that medicine is, because it is making a recommendation on dosing that the patient then directly follows without any intervention from a healthcare practitioner. That would be considered a medical device in its own right. Thank you. So from a practical perspective, and I did say this was going to be very short because we are going to be touching on some of these points in the later session. So for example, on medical devices in the next session, and on what you would want to maybe put in your terms and privacy notices in the final session. Practical tips from the outset are: think about your data and your data flows and make a record of it. Some people work with mind maps, for example, so they start off with their product in the middle and then have the different sources coming in on one side and the different outputs on the other side. Doesn't really matter how you record it, but if you make a record, that is then really helpful, because you can share that with your lawyer at the end, or the Information Commissioner, who obviously regulates data privacy in the UK. If they had any questions, you can then produce this record of your data flows. If you're working internationally, think about whether you might need some additional contracts. Consider the need for a data privacy impact assessment. I mean, you could do it as part of your record, just to be sure. There will be cases where you legally are required to have one, but if you're working with particularly sensitive data, it might be worth doing it anyway. Then the other point practically that I see quite often is people get informed patient consent for treatments mixed up with data privacy consents. Just be aware that people might be talking about consent in completely different contexts. So a data privacy practitioner will be talking about something else to a clinician, although there is sometimes a bit of overlap between the two of them. So make sure you keep those separate. Only use consent for data privacy if you have no other option, because it can be withdrawn and then you have to stop using the data, which could impact on your product development if that is one of the things you use your data for. And then the other one is don't just think about what you want to do immediately now, but also the direction of travel for your product, because you can start building blocks now that will help you launch future iterations if you get it right at the beginning. And that is why, as a lawyer, it can be frustrating if we don't get involved at the end, until the end, and no one has thought about these things, because then you have to go all the way back and work through these things, which could then obviously potentially delay you and getting a good product out to patients or users. And I think that was it from me.
Thank you, Steph.
Happy to take your questions.
No, that's brilliant. I'm just going to stop sharing for a second, so you can all see our faces, and ask a couple of questions, if I may. I'm going to use my chair prerogative to ask a couple first that I'm interested in, and then we've got a couple from the audience as well. So I think that there's two topics that always crop up in these sessions: Brexit and COVID. And so I'm going to ask a question on each of those. In terms of the pandemic, how has that affected the digital health landscape? Or has it affected the digital health landscape, and how? And has it had a positive or negative impact? I asked Liz first, but I will ask Steph to answer from what she sees as well in the legal profession. Thanks, Liz.
Sorry, so was this the Brexit question or the
Sorry, COVID
question?
first, then we'll do
COVID
Brexit.
first, yeah. Okay, yeah, so COVID, I mean, I know I shared some stats on this, so uptake has massively increased since the start of COVID. So we've all been looking to digital to help with everything in our life, including things like this. So we would normally do these kind of sessions in person, but we're now using digital in a much different way. And we've definitely started to, as people, we have absolutely seen an increase. I think I shared with you that there's been a 25% increase in people using digital health solutions. And the reason for that is because if you're a vulnerable person living with a condition, you're less likely to want to go into a healthcare environment while the virus was, extreme, because there's a higher risk of you getting that. And equally, it's more important that you look after yourself because you're not now able to engage with those healthcare professionals as often. And then obviously we've seen a significant increase in digital health teleconsultations. So healthcare professionals now using digital to have consultations with patients. And what that's meant is that healthcare professionals are now much more aware of the use of digital health and the impact, and people and patients are now happy to use these platforms to have teleconsultations. And what better thing to recommend at the end of a teleconsultation than a digital health app that you can send directly to your patient's phone. So we've absolutely seen an increase. There is still quite a lot more to do. So one of my fears actually with COVID is people will think that we've ticked the digital health box now, and we've done that. Well, the reality is we've only just started with scratching on the surface, and all we've done is push the challenge one step down the pathway. So I'll just give you an example and then I'll stop talking. If I am a GP and I'm now seeing patients online through teleconsultation, that has taken that first barrier away. But for most patients that primary care see, we may be inviting to go on for further diagnostics or referring them on to other services. And for some diagnostics, I mean, Stephanie touched on a product there that can do ECG monitors. At the minute, if I'm a GP, what do? I can't now send you for that 8-patient appointment. However, there are digital health solutions that I could be recommending that you use, so long as they're safe, to take over that diagnostic. There are also other tools that we can use for interventions for services that may not be accessible, or what we're seeing more likely now, the waiting lists are significant. So in a nutshell, yes, but there's more to do.
Thanks, Liz. Steph, have you seen a change in terms of instructions and matters and clients really coming across your desk over the last 12 months?
What I've seen is a shift in previously, if you were providing a service via a health app, it was usually because there was an existing need already in the NHS in terms of waiting lists, and particularly in the mental health space, and people were trying to launch products in order to fill a gap that was already there. And I think that there's now been a shift in terms of acceptability of that as a route for appropriate care for some people. But what I've seen particularly is in the medical device regulatory space is that the MHRA has made a huge effort to support businesses who were offering devices or medicines that could help with the pandemic, and they had a dedicated inbox that you could send queries to. There were some kind of emergency use authorizations, for want of a better phrase, in order to get things to patients quickly while data was still being gathered. And it didn't didn't mean that they were allowing things out that weren't safe. It was just they were trying to help with the red tape of regulatory, where you might normally have to wait 90 days to get something. They were trying to turn it around fairly quickly. So actually, I think what we've seen in from my side of the fence is that our regulators have been trying really hard to help people get their products out there if they believe that they could help with the pandemic, while still trying to keep their usual caseload going. And that has been really nice to see, because I think lawyers and regulators often get a bad rap for making things take longer. And I think in this instance, we've all kind of stepped up to the plate to try and get things through to users as quickly as possible.
I think as well, what I've seen is actually the use of digital in order to speed up processes that historically took longer, which you know, you really need to look at the speed at which the vaccine was developed as a really obvious example of something that usually takes years, that through the benefit of the technology that we now have available, we've been able to, well, not me personally obviously, but people involved have been able to do that a lot quicker. And you can see the same with other things that historically you know, have taken longer, and that's just been accepted that they take that length of time. I mean, look at you know, ORCHA. I know that you guys were brought in originally to support the NHS App Store, because obviously that process was taking such a long period of time for people to get. By the time their app had been approved, they'd got a new version out, probably 3 versions further down the road. So, and obviously your use of a technology-enabled solution. So that I think is quite interesting as well, that we're using digital technology in order to support the adoption of digital technology in health, which is a nice shift. Just quickly, in terms of Brexit, and we can go into this, we can talk in more detail about Brexit next time as well, but again, just I'll start with Steph, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
From your perspective, in terms of the regulatory and legal aspects, what impact has and will continue to have, has leaving the EU had and will continue to have on sort of health app and medical device space?
I think it's made everything a bit more complicated from a regulatory perspective, because we now have 2 regimes within Great Britain. So you've still got the medical device regime that is applicable in the European Union. They've got the medical device regs that are coming into force this month, which will make things stricter there. The UK is still working under the old medical device rules, with a slight exception for Northern Ireland with the Northern Ireland Protocol. And there have been changes already to the UK rules on medical devices, because we had the Cambridge review with recommendations that came out of that. So we're already seeing a slight divergence between the UK and the rest of Europe, and going forward that there might be a requirement to have 2 sets of compliance rules, although it's possible that what we will see is that the UK's path will become easier for innovators. So it might be that in the UK, and then once you have a product launched, you can use that that data that you're gathering once you have the product in order to support you with your European regulatory compliance. So I think bottom line is still a lot of uncertainty, quite a lot of complications.
But potentially some opportunity in terms of sort of the UK market, and a place for innovators to set up and get going. Liz, from your perspective, how are you seeing Brexit play out?
So I mean, I would have said exactly as Stephanie did, focused on that medical device regulations. I think what we really need at the moment is just clarity, because it is confusing and it's not yet clear what those differences will be, for what length of time. And I think that one of the things that is quite often lacking, which is why I'm hoping that these sessions are useful for people, is that communication of these changes in that regulatory landscape. And most people who have a digital health innovation, they're not just looking to working, say, in the UK or just in a country, because the opportunity is global. And so we have to be aware of the differences and have that clarity about what they mean. And equally, you know, we need that communication to be built into training. So if something's got a medical device CE certification from a European basis, can I use that as a trusted guide to recommending a product to my patient? That's all I want to know. And so we just need some clarity around this space, which I think will come, and we'll keep sharing where things are at the moment.
That's actually a really interesting point for both of you, because we've got a couple of questions that we've been asked. They both relate to mental health, but I'll ask this one first. Is how is the CQC viewing mental health services being provided in the UK by international service providers? So that's obviously international service providers providing mental health services in the UK. How is the CQC viewing that? Steph, have you got any thoughts? I mean, I suppose if something needs to be CQC registered, it needs to be CQC registered. So I'm assuming that they would be viewed in exactly the same way as any other service provider. Is that the case?
Sorry, my internet cut out briefly while you were asking the question. But I think that what is quite challenging is that if the law says there has to be CQC registration for the relevant person that is providing the service, you quite often can't get around that by having the providers located somewhere else. But we do recognise kind of dual qualifications, and there are some instances where you can provide them with international qualifications, but I'd have to look into that in a bit more detail.
The question writer is anonymous, so if you would like some more information on that, then do drop us a line direct to our email addresses, which will be on the screen in a second. And Liz, from your perspective in terms of mental health apps, the question's been asked. This question was asked whether you have any information on, and I'm pretty sure that you do, so I'm sure I've seen it, mental health apps by age groups. For example, are there particular apps used by children and teenagers compared to adults?
Yeah, so different. There are over 20,000 health apps for mental health, and when you break that down into 17 subcategories: depression, anxiety, eating disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar, etc., you break that down, you can still see that there's a lot of products across all of the different mental health categories. When you then start to look at the ages and who these products are targeting, the majority of them are actually targeting adults. And although there are certain products that are available for children and for teenagers, what you then see on what people are downloading just from the app stores, most people are downloading the products that are most well known, so the ones that have high marketing budgets, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they meet your personal needs. So if you're a teenager, what you probably want as an interface will be different to, say, somebody like me. So my son would want something different to me. And one of the things that we run quite a lot of research on users' attitudes towards digital health, and teenagers get really frustrated because on the app stores it says that a product is free, but then there are in-app purchases. And for that first 5 days, a teenager may be experiencing some benefit from that product, but then after 5 days, there's a cost and they maybe don't have access to money. So I think that we're back to those problems that I mentioned before. It's not that there aren't products out there, it's just that people don't know about them and don't know where to find them. So for teenagers, they're interested in having an interface which is useful for them and meets their needs, but also cost is a massive requirement. Most teenagers don't have access to money. Most teenagers don't, I have a teenager myself, don't want to talk about their mental health, don't want to talk, full stop. They definitely don't want to talk about their mental health. So, and then for children, you know, I also have a 7-year-old child, he would want something different again. So yes, there are products available. What I'd say across the board though, in digital health is there is a lot less products targeting children and mental health than there are in the adult space, and children are not mini adults, they need something different. So that's a real opportunity from an innovation point of view.
Thanks,
Liz. And I think partly, or at least my experience has been that people shy away from launching products for children and teenagers because it's a bit more complex in terms of the legalities, because you might need parental or guardian consent or for purchases or for downloads or supervision of use of the app, and so a lot of people shy away from the risk that is associated with if they get it wrong. Yeah. But actually there are mechanisms in place that mean you can launch something that is compliant and still useful for those target audiences.
And just one thing I was just going to add there, NICE actually recommend digital first for children and teenagers living with mental health conditions, and that's because a lot of drugs are not prescribable to children and young people. So, you know, there's that policy drive. Unfortunately, there aren't enough digital health solutions in this space, and the need, unfortunately, is growing, particularly since lockdown. So it's a really good space for people to get into. And as Stephanie said, there are some hurdles, but you can get through them.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to wrap it up because we are at time. I'm just going to share this. Hopefully it works. So as you can see, anyone who's still got, please do sign up for the future events. Details are on the screen and the link will be provided. And finally, our contact details are on the final page. You'll be asked to complete a form with your feedback, and we would really appreciate it for the future sessions. We shall see you in a few weeks' time for the next session, which will focus more on that development stage and a deeper dive into some of those issues that Liz and Steph has raised today. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and hopefully see you in a few weeks. And thanks to the speakers.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Charlotte.